I will be connecting a GoPro to a Raspberry Pi so that I can use the Raspberry Pi to capture the footage from the GoPro so that I can see it anywhere. Effectively a makeshift security camera. In order to do this, I will use this GoPro, this Raspberry Pi, some cables, and a TV. So, this did not go as planned. At no point did I manage to get a feed from the GoPro onto the Raspberry Pi, but I've tried so many different things that I can now make a video out of the things that I've tried, rather than actually connecting the GoPro to the Raspberry Pi. So the first few things I did were all fairly similar. I found a bunch of Raspberry Pi forums and discussion pages that mention various Python projects for doing something similar to this. So I decided to try out some of those. Usually the ones with some actual documentation. And most of these were fairly similar to do and didn't work for fairly similar reasons. So the first thing that I had to do for this phase of my little project was to actually connect the GoPro to the Raspberry Pi in some way. And the easiest way to do this is with Bluetooth. So I connected to the GoPro through the command line in Raspbian, and this actually involved setting the GoPro to try to connect to the GoPro app, which it would then try to pair with any Bluetooth device, and it wouldn't recognize that it had paired to a Bluetooth device, but the Bluetooth device that it had paired to would recognize that it was paired to the GoPro. So that was a bit weird and actually took me a while to figure out because I was looking for the GoPro to do something rather than the device to do something. The next step was to try to actually make the GoPro do something over Bluetooth to try to control it. And this is where I hit my first major roadblock, because the Python library that is used by most of these scripts to try and talk to the GoPro in a way that it wasn't entirely built to do, it doesn't have the functionality included by default, is called Bleak. And Bleak does have a version that works for Linux. The problem is that Bleak wouldn't run on the version of Linux on the Raspberry Pi. Now, about a week after the fact, I realized that this might be because I haven't updated Raspbian on the Raspberry Pi in about 2 years, so it'd be entirely reasonable if it's no longer if it's a version of Linux that Bleak no longer supports. But every time I tried to install something that included Bleak, or just Bleak itself, once I started going down that path, it would give a basically no Linux compatibility error. Having checked Bleak's documentation, it says it does support Linux, but with a few requirements. So I suspect that's what the problem with that is. The next thing that I try to do is use some scripts and Python programs that controlled the GoPro over Wi-Fi. Two problems, though. This Raspberry Pi that I have doesn't have any wireless functionality on its own. It actually is using one of these little USB sticks for Bluetooth, which unfortunately does not work with Wi-Fi. And connecting the GoPro to the router was technically possible, but not something I had the skill set or tools to actually do. And connecting the Raspberry Pi to the GoPro's Wi-Fi was not possible because the Raspberry Pi doesn't have Wi-Fi functionality. So the next thing I tried to do is use a more official program called Motion. Problem is, Motion A had the Bleak problem, and then having managed to circumvent that, use a different version of it, it couldn't recognize the GoPro because of the Wi-Fi issue. Then, having sort of run out of forum discussions about this, I decided to look for something slightly more official, a computer board software called Motion iOS. It does use the Motion program as its basis, but it has an actual interface and some things added to it. So I tried to flash that OS onto the SD card, this little one right here, that is the main storage for the Raspberry Pi. The problem is that when I tried to flash it using my laptop, it got all of the way there and then crashed at the very end once it had already completed. And then Windows stopped being able to recognize that there was actually a drive there. So that was a bit of an impasse. I eventually discovered, with some help, that the problem was actually the micro SD card USB reader that I had. So using another one did allow me to flash Motion iOS onto the Raspberry Pi. And then managed to get the Raspberry Pi to boot with that. I managed to connect to the Raspberry Pi, get into the web interface. The problem is, GoPros don't have any streaming functionality, and they can't really be connected to over a network very easily. Same problem as before. They do, however, work perfectly fine when connected to USB, with GoPro's own desktop or phone app. And the newer versions of the GoPro that I was using at that time would actually stop allowing you to interact with it at all if it was plugged into USB. So I then had to go back to using this GoPro, which is a Hero 5 Black, I believe, which does allow you to record while it is plugged into USB. And Motion iOS could recognize that there was a camera, could recognize that it was recording, and could recognize that there was footage, but there was some overlap between two things needed to happen. One of them would only happen when it wasn't recording, and one of them was only happening when it was recording. So that stopped working. And because I don't currently have access to the SD card reader that works, I can't flash Raspbian back on and try to update it now that I've realized that that might be the problem. Also, I've now been working on this for 2 weeks, and I'd like to make this video and move on to something else. So, thank you for watching. Excuse me for a minute.